I wanted to come in person to the crime scene on King Road in Moscow, Idaho at night, sort of eerily peaceful at this crime scene. This is an idea of what it would have looked like the night of the murders. The media circus has left. I am the only reporter here right now, and you can hear a pin drop out there.
Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, Madison Mogan, and Kaylee Gonsalves were brutally stabbed to death in the middle of the night, and we still don't know why. What was the motive? Who was the target? Now, these are some of the biggest unanswered questions in the case of the Idaho Four, and I've waded through all of the information out there about the crime, the victims, and the suspected killer, Bryan Kohberger, to piece together some answers. This attack was brutal, it was extremely violent, and it was personal. But why did the killer do it? Could the answer be as simple as a crime of passion? Well, just days after the murders, Bryan Kohberger allegedly told his neighbor just that. Now, this was weeks before cops would zero in on him as their prime suspect. The neighbor told a CBS reporter that Kohberger brought up the murders in casual conversation and said, quote, "It seems like they have no leads, like it was a crime of passion." The 28-year-old PhD student has been described by those who know him as being pretty awkward, particularly with women. In the weeks since his arrest, only one ex has come forward, and the term ex is really an overstatement. These two went on an awkward first date many years ago, and that is as far as it went. And a brewery owner in Pennsylvania claims that Kohberger made his female employees and customers uncomfortable by pressing them with questions about their living situations and getting irritated when his advances were rebuffed. So we've got this picture of a guy who isn't great with women and may have had an axe to grind, particularly if one of the female victims turned him down or ignored him, which is my working theory. Plus, some experts think that the killer was satiating a sexual desire. None of the victims were sexually assaulted, and criminologist Dr. Casey Jordan believes that the murderer was supplementing the act of stabbing for the act of sex. Up to this point, none of the evidence that we are aware of reveals a direct link between the victims and the suspect. Kaylee's family said that they don't really recognize Kohberger at all, but they added that they are seeing connections between him and Kaylee. And sources say he followed all three of the female victims on social media. Now, a bunch of fake accounts have popped up on Instagram purporting to be him, but one account at crim.kohberger may actually be the real deal. A source with a connection to the investigation also came forward saying that the suspect allegedly messaged one of the girls repeatedly on Instagram and got no response. Now, the messages were described as being innocuous, just a "hey, how are ya?" but they were ignored, which may have been interpreted as rejection. Even if Kohberger did follow the victims on Instagram, how he came across them in the first place is another piece of the mystery. Bryan was new to the area, having moved to nearby Pullman, Washington in June of 2022 to begin his doctorate in criminology at Washington State University. WSU and the University of Idaho, where the victims were students, are just 10 miles apart with pretty much nothing but farmland in between. Moscow, Idaho is this really quaint, inviting, charming little town, while Pullman is just kind of cold by comparison. WSU students often go to Moscow to eat and shop and hang out and things like that. Kohberger is also a strict vegan. When I was staying in the area, I looked for vegan restaurants and there just weren't any. The best you could hope for are vegan menu options, and one of the first places that pops up when searching for that is the Mad Greek in Moscow, and that is where two of the victims, Maddie and Xana, worked. A former employee told People magazine that Kohberger came in more than once for a vegan pizza. Now, the owner of the Mad Greek swiftly denied that story, but the report also said that police are aware of the visits and took surveillance video from the area. From the get-go, police were convinced that these murders were targeted. Now, law enforcement never said who they believed the target was, but a lot of people think it was Kaylee Gonsalves. Now, determining who was killed first could be the best indicator as to figuring out the killer's main target. And one of these surviving roommates told cops that she was awoken around 4 a.m. to noises coming from the third floor. Now, that is where Kaylee and Maddie were sleeping. At the time, she thought it was Kaylee playing with her dog, but then she heard one of the girls saying something chilling. "Someone is here." The killer also dropped a knife sheath on the bed next to Maddie's body, so it's likely that this was the spot he first removed the murder weapon from the sheath. Now, the ferocity of Kaylee's wounds suggests two things. The first is that the majority of the killer's rage was directed at her, and the second is that she may have been the first kill when the murderer was at his strongest. Kaylee's dad has also pointed out, if those girls weren't a target, the killer would have had no reason to go up to the third floor. Xana and Ethan were found on the second floor, nearest to where cops think the murderer entered and exited. All of that points to the killer starting the stabbings on the third floor with Maddie and Kaylee. Now, DNA transfer from victim to victim will forensically determine the order of death, but that will not come out until trial. So if the third floor victims were the main target, why were Xana and Ethan also killed and two other roommates left alive and unharmed? Maddie, Kaylee, and Ethan were all killed in bed, but Xana was likely up and awake. She was on TikTok minutes before being stabbed to death, and she had defensive wounds, and her body, unlike the others, was found on the floor. The surviving roommate heard crying coming from Xana's room after the noises upstairs, and the killer, she said something to the effect of, "I'm going to help you." Prior to her death, Kaylee Goncalves mentioned having a stalker. She was referring to two guys in particular who police found and cleared, neither of whom were Bryan Kohberger. But just because that lead didn't pan out doesn't mean that the victims weren't being stalked. According to law enforcement, the suspect's phone pinged in the area of the home 12 times in the months before the murders, and Kaylee's family said Kohberger allegedly got so close he connected to their Wi-Fi with his own phone. And this particular home at 1122 King Road is just an easy target. It's 3 floors, it has a really unique layout, and it's situated on a hill.
Where I'm standing is the vantage point that the alleged killer would have had if he parked back here, which is where the Hyundai was seen and what cops believe happened.
And depending on where you stand, you can see directly into every single window. Now, as I mentioned, the layout of the house is strange. The first floor has 2 bedrooms. The second floor also has 2 bedrooms, as well as the main living area, which is accessed by this sliding glass door in the back. There are also 2 bedrooms on the 3rd floor. The timeline of the murders has been narrowed down to less than 20 minutes between 4:04 a.m. and 4:20 a.m. Now, in order to get in, kill 4 people, and get out in that time frame with such a strange floor plan, the killer had to have had a solid idea of how this house was laid out. Now, this was a popular off-campus party house, and based on everything that I have learned and researched, it's plausible that the killer had been inside maybe more than once, just disguised as a partygoer. Law enforcement has searched high and low for the military-style K-bar knife that the suspected murderer used. It's a standard issue knife given to members of the Marine Corps. The sheath has this insignia of the military branch stamped on the side. The medical examiner confirmed that the victims died by multiple stab wounds by a fixed blade knife in the upper body and torso. Now, the sheath was dropped next to Maddie's body, and it contained the killer's DNA. Unfortunately, though, for investigators, the murder weapon didn't turn up at the crime scene or during a search of Kohberger's apartment and office on the WSU campus. Now, his white Hyundai Elantra was dissected by a forensics team as well, and it's possible, albeit unlikely, that the knife was recovered there, but the results of that search are currently under a gag order. Now, the route that police believe the alleged killer drove from the scene of the crime back home is this long, winding, roundabout journey through just pitch black, sprawling farmland.
This is the house behind me. It's a very sort of desolate, just residential area. It looks like it's the middle of the night here, but it is just about 6 p.m. and there is little to no foot traffic or cars coming down.
Kohberger and his father also drove cross-country in December from Washington to Pennsylvania, which would have provided ample opportunities to potentially discard a murder weapon. The next court date is a ways away, June 26th, but this hearing will lay out almost everything that the prosecution has on Kohberger, including a boatload of information we don't yet know about. The probable cause hearing usually happens within 2 weeks of arraignment, but Kohberger waived his right to a speedy trial. So in this case, the prosecution and the defense have roughly 5 months to prepare. When the date finally comes, both sides will present evidence and call witnesses so a judge can determine whether or not there is enough for this case to go to trial, and we expect it to. Now, as it stands right now, Bryan Kohberger is facing 4 counts of first-degree murder and felony burglary, and he hasn't yet entered a plea.